He smells like gunpowder. 4 words, whispered into the neck of a Hells Angels dog at a 2-pump gas station on a cold Montana Saturday. The biker crouched 3 feet away, pretending not to hear, hearing every word. They were the first words an 11-year-old boy had spoken in 3 years, 2 months, and 4 days. And he spoke them 29 hours before someone had scheduled his death. He hadn't spoken to his teachers, hadn't spoken to the social workers, hadn't spoken to the judge who signed his guardianship papers, though all of them had seen his notepad and handed it back without reading it all the way through. 3 people had already seen the marks on his wrists that day and walked away. So he crossed 40 feet of cracked asphalt and chose a biker's dog instead. Before Sunday's sunrise, 109 Hells Angels would be parked along a logging road in the Montana dark. Not to make noise, but to stop what had been quietly scheduled for 6 o'clock in the morning. This is the story nobody was supposed to be able to tell, because the plan had counted on a boy who couldn't speak. They miscalculated. Those 4 words hit me differently every time I go back to them. If this story deserves to be heard, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. City, state, living room TV, phone in a quiet house. Drop it in the comments, now. Let's go back to where it started. I haven't talked in... I didn't know if I still could. Emmett said that second. 11 more words, delivered to the asphalt between his feet. It was the first time in over 3 years that anyone had heard his voice, and it sounded like something that had forgotten the mechanics of being used. Thin, tentative, a sound learning to trust the air again. But we need to go back further than that. Back to a boy walking alone on the shoulder of US 89 in socked feet, carrying his boots in one hand, so the sound of them on gravel wouldn't carry. Coal Ridge, Montana sits in the high valley between 2 ridgelines, the kind of place the rest of the country only finds on maps when something goes wrong. 2,100 people, 1 grocery store, a diner on Main Street that serves breakfast until 2 in the afternoon, and on Ridge Summit Road, a private boarding school called Hargrove Academy, a school that takes in troubled boys, at-risk youth, the children who've slipped between the system's fingers. Most of the county considers Hargrove a good thing. Most of the county considers its dean, Nolan Greer, a good thing, too. He runs the scout troop. He delivers for the food bank on Thursdays. He organized last year's blood drive at Coal Ridge Memorial. He's the kind of man whose name gets mentioned in the community newsletter alongside words like dedicated and selfless, and the kind of neighbor you hope moves in next door. We'll get to Nolan Greer. But first, the boy. Emmett Ray Hale arrived at Ridgeline Gas and Tire at 3:22 in the afternoon. 39 degrees, dropping. High thin clouds the color of old tin. Wind picking up from the northwest, carrying pine resin and the first cold threat of what was coming down from the mountains. He'd walked 2 miles from the school in socked feet, boots held in his left hand so the gravel wouldn't announce him. He'd left through a side gate he'd spent 4 months loosening, 1 careful push at a time, never enough in any single day to notice, always enough to count. He had no phone, no money, no ID. What he had was a notepad, not a nice one. A spiral-bound 3x5 with a cracked cover, pages packed with the smallest, most controlled handwriting you've ever seen. Emmett had filled 7 of them in the 22 months he'd been at Hargrove. Not because he was a writer, because he could not speak, and because when the world takes away your voice, you write things down. Not to be remembered, but so there's proof you existed at all. He'd been 8 years old, in the back seat of his parents' car on a Thursday evening when a pickup truck ran a red light on US 89 and came through the intersection at full speed. Both of his parents died on impact. Emmett was lifted out of the wreckage by a first responder who then crouched beside his mother and covered her face with a jacket. He had not said a word since. Not one. In 3 years, 2 months, and 4 days. He communicated by writing, by pointing, by the kind of precise, unblinking observation that children develop when the world becomes a place you cannot ask questions in. His eyes were wide-set and pale gray, and they recorded everything: the positions of people in a room, the way a voice changed when a person was about to do something dangerous, the distance between himself and the nearest exit. He'd learned to read environments the way other children read books. On his left wrist, he wore a water-damaged Casio watch with a cracked face. His father's watch, recovered from the accident scene. The display still worked. The backlight still came on when he pressed the side button. He tapped it 3 times, always 3, when the fear in his body was running ahead of his mind's ability to name it. He was tapping it when he reached the gas station lot. Nearly empty. One truck refueling on the far pump. A propane sign swinging against the building wall on a single hinge, making a low, hollow clank on every gust. The smell of motor oil and road dust and cold air coming down off the mountains in long, slow waves. And at the air pump on the east wall, crouched beside a motorcycle, one knee on the asphalt, a pressure gauge in his right hand, a man in a worn leather vest. At his side, sitting motionless as something carved, a brindle pit bull, broad-skulled, deep-chested, eyes the color of old amber, watching the highway with a patience that looked ancient. Emmett had been watching that dog for 9 minutes before he moved. He'd already tried 3 times that afternoon. The first try, a couple crossing toward their SUV, both carrying convenience store bags. He stepped into their path and held up the notepad. The words read, "I need help. Please call 911. Do not call the school." The man glanced at it, looked at his wife, said, "Not our problem," and stepped around the boy without slowing. The woman never looked at the notepad at all. Emmett filed that one. Some people are in a hurry. Some have learned not to get involved. He'd known this. The second try was harder. A man, maybe 60, with former military posture, the kind of straight-spined bearing that gets drilled in young and never fully leaves. He'd actually stopped. He'd read the notepad. He'd seen the forearm, the purple-brown grip marks, 4 distinct finger impressions pressed into the skin above the wrist. He'd seen the rope burn scars, raised and pink, circling both wrists. Recognition had crossed his face, clear and unmistakable. 3 full seconds of it. Then his gaze moved to the Hargrove Academy logo on Emmett's sweatshirt. He raised one hand, slowly, the way you back away from something you've decided not to understand. And he got in his truck, and drove north until he was gone. 3 seconds. That was how close it had come. The third rejection was the one that used up hope the fastest. 2 men in orange safety vests, neighborhood watch volunteers doing their weekly US 89 walk, the kind of men whose photos appear in the community newsletter beside words like dedicated and keeping our streets safe. They came toward Emmett with the particular energy of people who perform helpfulness as much as they offer it. "Son, you okay? You from the academy up the road?" Emmett shook his head hard and held up the notepad. "Do not call the school." One man pulled out his phone. "Don't worry, son. We know exactly who to call." He heard the words clearly. "Hey, Nolan. Yeah, we've got one of yours down at Ridgeline Gas." The man lowered the phone and smiled. "Dean Greer takes real good care of his kids. We'll get you back safe." Safe. 3 taps on the Casio watch. Emmett heard the sound of a diesel engine somewhere on US 89, still distant. He had maybe 4 minutes. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Just a moment. Most of us have known someone who had Nolan Greer's shape. Not this particular man, in this particular small town in Montana. But the form of him, the volunteer, the food bank regular, the one whose name goes up first on every community notice. And most of us have felt that small, uncomfortable thing in the chest about someone like that. The vague unease you can't quite source. And most of us have talked ourselves out of it, because what do you do with an uneasy feeling when everyone around you calls the man wonderful? Emmett Hale held up a notepad that said, "Do not call the school." The neighborhood watch put him in a van. That's not stupidity. That's what misplaced trust looks like from the inside, working exactly as it was designed to. He watched the watch face for 60 seconds, listened for the diesel engine, still distant. He moved, not toward the biker, toward the dog. He kept his profile small, moved sideways along the fence line the way he'd learned to move along the school's walls, stopping twice, scanning, listening. On the second stop, the pit bull turned her broad head and looked directly at him across the lot. That was enough. He didn't stop again until his arms were around her neck, his face pressed against the warmth of her side, and the sound that had been living in his chest for 3 years, 2 months, and 4 days. That sound that had been pressed so far down, it had almost forgotten what it was, came out in 4 words. "He smells like gunpowder." The man with the pressure gauge set it on the asphalt. Very slowly, the way a man moves when he understands that speed is exactly the wrong tool. He turned. He put both hands on his own knees, palms up and open. He sat down on the cracked asphalt, not crouching, sitting, making himself the size of a child, because that was the only size that made sense right now. Wren didn't pull back. She leaned further in. "She picked you," the man said quietly. "That's good enough for me." If you believe what just happened matters, if you believe every child deserves one person who doesn't calculate the cost before they answer, subscribe. Drop your city in the comments below, because what happens next is exactly why this channel exists. What Emmett didn't know yet, and wouldn't know for several hours, was the full weight of who was sitting on that asphalt in front of him. Gideon Marsh was 54 years old, 14 years in the United States Army as a military police K-9 handler, 2 deployments, a left hand missing its ring finger from a vehicle door incident his 2nd year in service, a tattoo on his right forearm, a dog's silhouette above the word Atlas, the name of his working dog who'd been killed in Kandahar, and whose memory he carried the way some men carry a photograph, close to the chest, always. 11 years with the Glacier chapter of the Hells Angels, Sergeant at Arms, the man the chapter called when a situation had already moved past the point where talking would fix it, because Gideon didn't escalate, and didn't miss, and didn't leave until the thing was done. What people in Coleridge didn't know, he volunteered at the county animal shelter on Wednesday mornings. He'd quietly paid the vet bills for 2 elderly women on his street whose dogs needed surgery they couldn't cover. He'd never mentioned it. He didn't do it to be mentioned. He also had a nephew he'd never stopped looking for, his sister's boy, taken into foster care at age 6 when Gideon was on his 2nd tour. By the time he came home, the trail was already cold. The boy would be 19 now. Gideon still did the math, without meaning to, every time he saw a face in a certain age range. He looked at Emmett now and saw the rope burns, the grip marks, the faded scar above the right eyebrow that was too old to still be unexamined, the boots with no laces, held in one hand. He filed all of it. Then he said the only thing that made sense to say, "I won't call them." Not a promise wrapped in warmth, just a fact. "I haven't talked in—" The voice that came from Emmett's throat was barely a voice at all, something relearning its shape. I didn't know if I still could. I'm from the school up the road. I need you not to call them. I won't. A pause. The propane sign clanked once against the building wall. What's happening Sunday? Emmett's hand moved to the Casio watch. 3 taps, and he began to talk. They moved to the Coleridge Diner 3 blocks away. Red vinyl booths patched so many times the original color had become theoretical. A jukebox in the corner that nobody had fed quarters to since sometime in the previous decade. Gideon ordered coffee he didn't intend to drink. He told Emmett he could have anything on the menu. Emmett studied the menu for a long time before ordering the hot chocolate. When it arrived, he spent 30 seconds looking at it before touching it. Checking, the way you check something that might be taken back, Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything about it. I need to ask you one thing, he said. You don't have to answer out loud. You can write it. Emmett's hand was already on the notepad. How long have you been planning today? The boy looked at the table, picked up the pen, wrote 6 weeks. I tried the notepad approach 3 other times. Different days, different roads. Adjusted each time. 6 weeks of watching, timing, learning which gate, which road, which type of person might stop. Getting it wrong 3 times before getting it right. Gideon looked down at his own hands. The left one, with the missing finger. The tattoo on his right forearm. I had a nephew, he said. Quiet. Not a performance. Just setting a fact on the table between them. My sister's boy. He was 6 when I deployed the 2nd time. When I came home, he'd been taken into foster care. The trail was already cold. He'd be 19 now. He looked up. I've been carrying that for 13 years, looking for somewhere to put it down. Something shifted in Emmett's face. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The specific kind that comes from being offered a true thing instead of a managed one. He picked up the notepad. He wrote for a long time. He wrote the Ward C corridor. Or the converted storage room, 6 cots, no windows, 1 fluorescent bulb, padlocked from the outside at 9 p.m. A fire code violation the county inspector had never flagged, because the inspector received his annual outdoor recreation permit through Nolan Greer's Scout troop licensing network and had not found a reason to create complications. He wrote about the 5:30 a.m. physical drills, 7 days a week. The Sunday mornings, the school bus on the logging road, cell signal gone 2 miles before the gate. Boys returning from what the school called wilderness training, with marks they were told to say, came from rappelling practice. He wrote about a school therapist named Dr. Marsh, who had filed a wellness concern 14 months ago after he showed her a drawing of boys being marched into woods. The concern had been dismissed. Dr. Marsh had been reassigned to another district within the week. He wrote about the social worker he'd passed a note to 9 months ago. Please look at the woods behind the school on Sunday. The note that had been forwarded to the school's front desk. The 11 days of isolation that followed, listed in his school file as a behavioral stabilization period. He wrote about Danny Cole, 16 years old, enrolled September 2020, died August 2022 during a night navigation exercise. Ruled accidental drowning by the Clearwater County Medical Examiner. Case closed in 11 days. Danny Cole had a swim ribbon on his nightstand in Ward C. He'd won it 2 months before his transfer to Hargrove. It was still there. And then, last, Emmett wrote the conversation. 3 weeks ago, Wednesday night, 11:40 p.m. A bathroom pass in his pocket. A gap between the water heater and the exterior wall of the maintenance room, wide enough for a boy who'd learned to make himself small. Nolan's office door, ajar. 2 men who drove the compound bus. He wrote it word for word. The way you write something when you are 11 years old, and you understand, in the particular way traumatized children understand that the only power you have is the precision of your memory. Hale's the reason for the list. Trust review is February 3rd. He doesn't make it to February. I've done this before. Danny Cole, 2022. That was a night navigation exercise. Medical examiner ruled accidental drowning. Nobody looked twice. A set of $278,000 doesn't stay in trust forever. And the boy doesn't speak. Who's going to contradict me? He'd written it 7 times across 3 separate notepad entries, with date stamps each time. Gideon read the page twice. Set it on the table between them with the care you give to evidence, because that was exactly what it was. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the formica. From 2 booths away, a man who had been sitting quietly with a coffee, who looked like a retired teacher, because that was exactly what he was, glanced up at Gideon's face and sent a single text to a contact saved as copper. Worse than we thought. Previous victim may be confirmed. Get Driftwood on the phone now. You might be picturing what came next. A man like Gideon Marsh, reading words like he doesn't make it to February in a child's handwriting, getting to his feet, and roaring. Engines firing, 40 Hells Angels in formation down Main Street, arriving at a school like a force of nature. That is not what happened. What happened was precise, systematic, the kind of response that comes from decades of understanding that the loudest move is almost never the right one. Gideon picked up his phone, made a call that lasted 41 seconds. The call went to Forrest Dale, road name Copperhead, 56 years old, Glacier Chapter President. 6 years as a CPS intake worker before he quit in disgust because the paperwork kept moving while the children stayed where they were. Before that, 22 years as a Clearwater County detective. He knew every judge in the district by first name. He knew which documentation created federal jurisdiction versus state. He knew which steps, taken in the wrong order, would let a man like Nolan Greer walk out of a courtroom on a procedural technicality. Copperhead. It's Cinder. Talk to me. 11-year-old ward of a private school dean. Rope burns both wrists, grip marks on the forearm, scar above the eye. Says Sunday morning there's a transport of boys to a compound 14 miles into the forest. He overheard the dean say the boy won't make it to February. Trust money, $278,000. Previous child died at the compound, ruled accidental drowning. He was a competitive swimmer. 2 seconds of silence. Where are you? Coleridge Diner. Don't move. Razorback and Dust Cloud are already heading to you. Kettledrum needs to map that compound before we lose daylight. You have a name on the previous victim? Danny Cole, 2022. I'll have something on Cole in 20 minutes. Cinder. Yeah. This doesn't get fixed by showing up loud. You understand that. That's why I called you first. The line went dead. The calls went outward in a chain after that. Razorback arrived at the diner within 12 minutes. Former Gulf War combat medic, 2 tours, the brother you called when medical documentation needed to be done correctly, in language that would survive a courtroom in any county in Montana. He brought a first aid kit he didn't open uninvited. He set it on the seat beside him and ordered coffee and didn't look at it again until Emmett reached toward it himself, 20 minutes later. The rope burns on both wrists were documented, photographed, assessed, written up in clinical language, before 5 p.m. Dust Cloud was already in the booth across from Emmett. 61 years old. Former high school counselor for 14 years, retired 3 years ago. He understood selective mutism the way most people understand reading. It was just part of the vocabulary he'd spent decades building. He didn't ask Emmett questions. He sat close enough to be a presence and far enough to give the boy air. He ordered Emmett a second hot chocolate when the first went cold. Kettledrum drove north toward Ridge Summit Road while there was still enough daylight to work. 29 years old, the youngest in the Glacier chapter, carrying more computing power in his vest pockets than most county offices used in a given week. By dark, he was back with GPS coordinates for the compound, satellite imagery pulled from a state agricultural database, road conditions on the logging route, and a property records search showing 8 acres adjacent to the compound, recently purchased under an LLC called Clearwater Educational Trust. Driftwood made the first call to a judge at 6:43 p.m. 71 years old. Founding Glacier, chapter member. 3 judges in 2 states took his call at 2 in the morning without needing to know more than that it was Driftwood calling. He told the judge to hold his evening. Documentation was coming. It would be worth the wait. The judge had known Driftwood for 27 years. He cleared his schedule, and Copperhead, within the first hour, pulled everything available on Danny Cole, 16 years old, enrolled September 2020, died August 2022, ruled accidental drowning, case closed in 11 days, medical examiner of Record 1, Dr. Carl Fry, who had signed off on 4 other rulings connected to Hargrove properties over the past 8 years, all accidental, all closed within 2 weeks. Who else has Fry ruled on for Clearwater properties? Gideon asked when Copperhead arrived at the diner at 6:15. Copperhead set a printed page on the table. 4 rulings in 8 years. None of them triggered an inquest. None of them had a second opinion requested. He looked at Gideon. Here's what you need to understand about how Greer built this. He spoke carefully, the way you speak when you want someone to retain every word. In Montana, private residential school guardianship runs through a different legal circuit than standard foster or family court placement. There are no mandatory monthly welfare checks for privately placed children at licensed residential academies. Those checks were removed from the private school classification 4 years ago. Nolan Greer lobbied the county school board himself to eliminate them, citing administrative burden. The motion passed 4-2. Under the current classification, the Dean of Record is authorized as the sole wellness examiner. His wellness log is the recognized medical record. No outside physician is required. No independent audit. The table was quiet. What this means, Copperhead continued, is that every documentation trail leads back to Greer. His notes, his assessments, his account of every incident. The academic records are clean. The wellness log is complete. If we approach this through the state system, his attorneys argue the school operated within licensed parameters, and the case sits in administrative review for 6 months. And in 6 months, Gideon said, February has already come and gone. Exactly. So we don't go through the state system. We build a federal case. And for that, I need the trust documents, the ones showing the beneficiary amendment and the withdrawal pattern. From across the table, a quiet voice. I know where they are. Everyone looked at Emmett. 3 taps on the Casio watch. A locked filing cabinet in his office. The combination is the school's founding year. He uses it for every lock in the building. I know because I watched him open it 5 times through the window during early drills. Copperhead looked at the boy for a long moment, then at Gideon. Then he began to make calls. By 7 p.m., the Missoula chapter had 38 confirmed. Great Falls, rolling north already, would close the last 30 by dawn. 109 motorcycles converging on a valley town in the Montana dark. Not to the school, not yet. Staged along US 89 and the county road south of the logging road access. A perimeter. A net. Not a parade. Emmett sat in the corner booth and watched the men, the former detective, The combat medic, the retired counselor, the tech specialist, the elder who hadn't stopped his quiet phone calls since 6 o'clock, and something changed in the way he was sitting. Slowly, almost without him noticing, his shoulders came down from their permanent position near his ears. He looked like someone who had put down something very, very heavy. 3 taps on the Casio watch. Then his hand went still. 28 hours now, he said quietly. Not 31. No, Gideon said. Not 31. Outside, the first engines along Main Street cut off one by one. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the specific silence of something being in place, the way a forest goes quiet just before weather moves in. What Nolan Greer didn't know, at that hour, was that the thing his entire plan had been built on, the fact that the boy didn't speak, had stopped being true at 3:31 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon at a 2-pump gas station on US 89. And now, with 28 hours left before the school bus rolled toward a logging road, Gideon Marsh and a chapter president who knew every judge in Clearwater County were about to walk into a night that Nolan Greer had spent 2 years building, and start pulling the floor out from under it. The warrant was signed at 11:17 p.m. Driftwood had held the judge's attention for 40 minutes, by phone, then by fax, the old-fashioned kind, because some judges in rural Montana counties still trusted paper more than email attachments. By the time the signed document came through, Copperhead had 3 pages of supporting documentation already assembled. The trust amendment, 9 months of withdrawal records pulled from probate court filings, and a printed copy of Emmett's 7 notepad entries. Photographed in sequence, time-stamped, chain of custody noted in Kettledrum's precise handwriting on the cover sheet. The documentation on Danny Cole was separate. Copperhead set it in its own folder. He would come back to that. At 11:41 p.m., engines started along US 89. Not all of them. Not yet. The Great Falls chapter was still 90 minutes out on the mountain highway. 30 riders coming in from the south with their headlights cutting through October dark. But Glacier and Missoula, 79 motorcycles, staged quietly in 3 positions. A hardware store parking lot 2 blocks from the school, the county road shoulder half a mile from the logging road access, and the diner lot on Main Street where Copperhead had set up the documentation station in a corner booth and was still making calls. You're probably imagining this differently. 200, well, 109. Hell's Angels descending on a school in the middle of the night, engines thundering, leather everywhere, fear and chaos clearing the way. It's a reasonable thing to picture. It is not what happened. What happened at 11:52 p.m. was this. Gideon Marsh parked his motorcycle 2 blocks from Hargrove Academy, walked alone to the school's east entrance, and knocked on the door. No formation. No roar. 1 knock. The school's night supervisor opened the door. A man named Brent, 20s, who'd held the position for 4 months and would later tell investigators he'd thought it was a parent emergency. He saw a large man in a leather vest, calm, hands visible, and before he could produce a single word, Gideon said, "I need the school's filing records for Ward C, the trust documents for a child named Emmett Ray Hale, and the wellness log for the past 22 months. I have a warrant." Brent read the warrant twice. Then he made a phone call. The phone rang in a house 3 miles away, where Nolan Greer was sitting at his kitchen table going through next week's school calendar. When he heard Brent's voice, he was quiet for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Tell him to wait. I'll be there in 15 minutes." He drove in under 12. Nolan Greer in person looked exactly like his community reputation. Flannel shirt, Carhartt vest, close-trimmed beard, silver at the temples. He came through the school's front entrance at 12:03 a.m. with the particular composure of a man who had been through difficult conversations before and knew that composure was the main thing. He extended his hand to Gideon. Gideon did not take it. "I understand there's a situation," Nolan said. The voice was measured, warm in its construction, if not in its substance. The kind of voice you hear from the front of a church or behind a school board podium, authority worn lightly, like comfortable clothing. "I want to be helpful here. Whatever you've heard, I can explain." Gideon said nothing. Emmett Hale is a child with a significant trauma history. He doesn't communicate verbally, hasn't since placement. Whatever he may have communicated to you. He communicated it in writing, Gideon said. 7 separate entries, date stamped. A pause. Something moved across Nolan's face and moved off it again in under a second. The charm reset. "I'd like to call my attorney." "You're welcome to. The warrant covers the filing cabinet in your office, the main one, combination lock. The county records for the Clearwater Educational Trust, LLC, are already pulled. Your attorney will want to know that." The word attorney had slowed Nolan down. The phrase, Clearwater Educational Trust, stopped him entirely. That was phase 1 of 4. And the first crack had just appeared. While Gideon held Nolan Greer in the administrative wing, Razorback and 2 brothers from Missoula walked Ward C. No drama, no force. The night supervisor, Brent, had produced the combination on the corridor padlock. He didn't know what the number was for. He'd just been told to use it at 9 p.m. And the door swung open onto 6 cots, 6 thin blankets, 1 fluorescent bulb humming overhead. The floor was raw concrete. The air smelled like closed spaces and institutional laundry, and boys who hadn't been anywhere with open windows for a while. 5 boys were in their cots. The 6th, Emmett's, was empty, which Nolan Greer had not yet acknowledged knowing. Razorback documented every inch of that room. Measurements, temperature, photographs of the padlock hardware on the outside of the door. A fire code violation so obvious it would later make the county inspector's career considerably more difficult. The single plastic bin per child. The complete absence of personal items, outside of 1 swim ribbon hanging from the corner of a cot that could only be one boy's. Danny Cole's ribbon. Still there. On a nightstand that was actually just the edge of the cot frame. Hanging from a nail somebody had driven into the wall at some point in the room's previous life as a storage space. Razorback photographed it twice. The 5 boys in their cots were awake. Had been awake, probably, since Brent's phone call. Sound carries in old buildings. None of them spoke. They lay with their eyes open and watched the men with the cameras and the careful voices and the deliberate movements, and none of them said a word. Razorback knew that silence. He'd seen it in field work, in places where speaking had become associated with consequences. He didn't push. He pulled up a folding chair and sat at the end of the room and said quietly, to no one in particular, "You don't have to say anything right now, but we're going to be here until morning. And in the morning, some things are going to be different." One of the boys, maybe 13, with a bruise yellowing on his left jaw, asked, "Is Emmett okay?" "Yeah," Razorback said. "Emmett's the reason we're here." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, he said he had a plan. By the time the 4 witnesses arrived at the diner, all 4 called by Copperhead or by contacts Copperhead trusted, it was approaching 2 in the morning. Ruth Callahan had worked Hargrove Academy's kitchen for 11 years before she resigned 8 months ago. She was 71, had the deliberate stillness of someone who'd been holding something a long time and wasn't sure how to set it down carefully. She sat across from Copperhead, with her hands around a coffee cup she didn't drink from. "What I saw," she said, and then stopped, cleared her throat. Every Sunday when the bus came back from those trips, I was usually in the kitchen starting dinner prep, and the boys who'd been on the bus. They didn't come through the way normal kids come through after a day outdoors. They came through quiet, looking at the floor. Whoever was last in line always moved like something hurt. She looked at the table. I filed a concern with the county school board's anonymous line 16 months ago. Nothing happened. I thought maybe it wasn't enough to act on. I thought maybe I was reading it wrong. I thought a lot of things. Her voice did not break. It just went very flat. I don't think I was reading it wrong. Harold Pruitt had maintained county roads in the Coleridge district for 19 years. He'd noticed the school bus on the upper logging road, a route maintained as a fire access track, technically open to permitted vehicles, 4 Sundays out of 5 for 2 years running. He'd logged it twice in his maintenance records because vehicles on unimproved access roads created additional wear patterns. He'd assumed it was authorized. It appeared consistent and organized, and things that appear consistent and organized usually are. It never occurred to me to ask who authorized it, he said. That's on me. That's something I'll have to sit with. Carol Vance had been a Clearwater County School Board trustee when the vote came through to eliminate mandatory welfare checks for privately placed children at licensed residential academies. She'd voted against it. The motion had passed 4-2. She'd written a formal letter of concern to the state education office afterward, and received a form response thanking her for her input. 4 years ago, she said. 4 years this December. And every year since, when the renewal period came up, I raised the question again. Every year it was tabled. Nolan Greer attended every single one of those meetings. She looked directly at Copperhead. I want to be in that courtroom. Whatever I can do, testimony, documentation. I want to be there. The Forest Service ranger who'd logged the unofficial vehicle presence at Clearwater Ridge 3 separate times had come in plain clothes, off the record, under a name that wouldn't appear in any notes Copperhead kept from this evening. He was a practical man who understood the distinction between what he could observe in his official capacity and what he could tell a former county detective in a diner booth at 2 in the morning. No permits were on file for regular access, he said. The first time I logged it, I assumed it was an oversight. Private schools sometimes miscategorize their outdoor programs and apply for the wrong license tier. The second time, I flagged it to the district classification office. They said it was covered under the school's general outdoor education permit, and no additional filing was required. He paused. The third time, I drove up the access road. About a mile in, I stopped when I saw the camera on the tree. Motion activated. Not ours. He folded his hands. I didn't have anything I could formally cite, but I'm telling you now. Which brings us to what makes this kind of thing possible. Not the villain. That part is straightforward enough, once you know where to look. What makes it possible is the architecture built around him. A wellness log, signed only by the school's own dean, accepted as a state-recognized medical record under Montana's private school classification, because that classification was designed for small church schools with nurse volunteers, not for locked residential programs housing orphaned children with no surviving family. A county inspection system that flags fire code violations by reviewing submitted paperwork rather than visiting converted storage wings. An annual outdoor education permit that covers a school bus on an unimproved logging road 14 miles into federal forest. A probate court amendment that moved quietly through the system because the guardian filing it had a clean record, an impeccable community profile, and a child ward who communicated by notepad and had no one to call. Copperhead would explain it later to investigators this way. None of these systems were built badly. They were built for normal cases. The problem is that a man like Greer studies the normal case gaps the way a locksmith studies a lock. He's not breaking the system. He's using it. The way to stop it wasn't louder. It was more specific, which was exactly what 109 Hells Angels and a former county detective with a warrant in his pocket were in the process of being. At 12:47 a.m., in the administrative wing of Hargrove Academy, Nolan Greer made his second and third moves. His attorney was on the phone, a man named Callow, 63, who specialized in educational administration disputes and had handled 3 matters for Hargrove in the past 4 years. Nolan stood near the window with the phone to his ear, and across the room Gideon sat in a chair, unhurried, waiting. When the call ended, Nolan turned. The shoulders had come down from their defensive position. The palms went up, a gesture so rehearsed it had become invisible to him. The head tilted, just slightly. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Look, I've given 11 years to these kids. Most of them came to me with histories that would break your heart. What I do here isn't perfect, but it's real. Ask anyone in this county." Gideon let him finish. Then he said, "The trust amendment filed with Clearwater County Probate last year. Walk me through the conversation with the attorney who drafted the beneficiary change." The charm slipped. 1 second, visible to anyone watching his eyes. That was a standard estate planning measure. Emmett's signature on the amendment doesn't match his handwriting in any of the 7 notepads he's been filling for 2 years. Your wellness log is the only medical record that exists for him. The school bus has been on an unpermitted logging road 4 Sundays a month for 2 years. And Danny Cole was a competitive swimmer. Silence. Then Nolan straightened. The warm voice was gone. What replaced it was the other mode, colder, more precise. "You are in my school, without my invitation, on the basis of documentation provided by a non-verbal minor, with a documented history of behavioral episodes. My attorney is already drafting a false imprisonment filing. Whatever this is, the FBI has an open investigation." 3 words. Gideon said them the same way he'd said everything else. Level, no elevation, no performance. Nolan Greer went still. The kind of still that happens when you've been running calculations for months, and the math suddenly changes. "We have what they couldn't close," Gideon said. "They had the financial trail. We have the documentation and a living witness. That's the gap. You want to call your attorney again, that's your right. But I'd suggest you use the time you have before they get here differently." Nothing. "I'm not interested in your reasons," Gideon said. "Neither is he." Nolan Greer said nothing for a long time. His hands, which had been open, palms up, performing trust, closed into fists, then opened again. And in his eyes, for just a moment, the mask came off entirely, and what was underneath was not rage and not remorse. It was the specific, private panic of a man who had been absolutely certain this could not happen, confronting the fact that it was happening. He asked once whether someone could call his neighbor about his mail. The school had a delivery scheduled Monday. He said it flatly, the way you say something when the part of your mind trained to manage appearances is still running on routine, even though everything else has stopped. At 1:14 a.m., 2 Clearwater County Sheriff's deputies and an FBI field agent named Delgado arrived at Hargrove Academy. They read Nolan Greer his rights in the administrative wing hallway, under the fluorescent lights, while he stood in a Carhartt vest with his hands being drawn behind him. He looked up at the ceiling. He didn't speak. Stage 3B, Network Unraveling. It was Kettledrum who found it. He'd been running the property records on the Clearwater Educational Trust, LLC, when the search pulled a second address, not the 8 acres adjacent to the compound, but a mailing address in Billings, Montana, registered at the same time the LLC was formed. A post office box. Cross-reference to a law office, Alderman and Pruitt, civil probate. He brought it to Copperhead at 2:11 a.m. Copperhead looked at the name. Pruitt, he said. He opened his laptop, ran the name against the Clearwater County probate records he'd already pulled. Marcus Pruitt, 58, sole practitioner, civil probate specialist, Billings. 3 filings connected to Hargrove Academy in 4 years. 2 guardianship arrangements. The trust amendment. That's the man who drafted the beneficiary change, Copperhead said. A probate attorney in Billings, filing on behalf of a guardian in Coleridge. That's a 2-hour drive. Nobody retains an attorney 2 hours away for a routine estate matter, unless the nearby attorneys said no, or unless they need someone who doesn't ask too many questions. He looked at Kettledrum. Pull his full filing history against anything connected to private residential programs in Montana. Go back 8 years. Kettledrum worked in silence for 11 minutes. What came back wasn't subtle. 3 filings. 3 different schools. 2 other counties. 8 years. All involving minor children in private residential guardianship arrangements. All involving trust amendments naming the guardian as beneficiary. 2 of the 3 children had subsequently left their placements, listed in school records as family reunification with no forwarding documentation. The 3rd child had died. Not Danny Cole. A different child, a girl, 14 years old, listed as a drowning at an outdoor education site outside Missoula, 2019. Ruled accidental. Medical examiner of record, Dr. Carl Fry. The room went quiet. The refrigerator in the diner's back kitchen hummed. Somewhere on US 89, a motorcycle idled briefly and cut off. Kettledrum set the printed pages on the table, one at a time. Same financial pattern, he said. Different name, same attorney, same examiner, same cause of death. 3 years before Danny Cole. Copperhead looked at the filing date on the trust amendment in that case. Then at the date of death. The amendment had been filed 6 months before the girl died. The trust had dissolved to the guardian's estate per the amended terms, 11 days after the ruling. That's the template, Copperhead said. He tested it in 2019. Cole was the 2nd run. Hale was supposed to be the 3rd. He picked up the phone. Marcus Pruitt lived in a townhouse on the east side of Billings with his name on the mailbox and a law office sign in the ground floor window. He was already awake when the 2 Missoula chapter brothers knocked at 3:50 a.m. Whether from insomnia or from a phone call he'd already received wasn't immediately clear. He opened the door in a bathrobe, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the look of a man who had constructed many reasonable explanations in advance and wasn't entirely sure which one to deploy first. Copperhead came up the front walk at a measured pace. He set a single printed page on the doorstep between them. The financial filing summary. 3 cases, 8 years. Tell me everything, Copperhead said. From the beginning. How it started, what you were told, what you were paid, all of it. Or I make one call, and you answer to people with considerably less patience than I have right now. Marcus Pruitt looked at the page, looked at Copperhead. Looked at the 2 brothers standing at the bottom of the porch steps. Not moving, not threatening, simply present in the way that 230 pounds of former combat veteran is present at 4 in the morning. He broke in under 3 minutes. He'd met Nolan Greer through a mutual acquaintance in the private school administration network. Greer had explained the arrangement as protecting a guardian's financial interest. Standard estate planning, he'd said. For situations where a ward's trust was at risk of going to the state if the child died without a family designation. Legally defensible, if structured carefully. The first time, Pruitt had filed the paperwork. The child in Missoula had died within the year. He'd told himself it was coincidence. The payout had been $97,400. The second time, Danny Cole, he'd filed again. He told himself the first time had been coincidence. He told himself Greer was a community leader with an impeccable record. He told himself the children in Greer's care came from situations of such profound disadvantage that anything was better than the alternative. He told himself a great many things. Danny Cole died in August 2022. The trust dissolved. The payout was $163,400. When Greer came to me with the Hale Amendment, Pruitt said, his voice very flat now, the particular flatness of a man hearing himself out loud for perhaps the first time, I told myself I was just doing the paperwork, that it wasn't my job to question a guardian's estate planning, that I didn't know what was going to happen. He stopped. I knew, he said. I knew what the pattern was. Copperhead was quiet for a moment. Not from softness, from the specific weight of hearing someone say the true thing out loud after a long time of not saying it. There are people who do terrible things because they have decided to be terrible. And then there are people who drift, one rationalizable step at a time, into being the person who makes terrible things administratively possible. They don't think of themselves as the villain. They're just the paperwork. They're just the attorney. They're just following the legal procedure. The first kind is easy to understand. The second kind sits in a bathrobe at 4 in the morning in Billings and says, I knew, in a voice that has run out of explanations for itself. Pruitt told them everything. 2 hours, a legal pad, Copperhead taking notes in the same precise handwriting he'd used for 22 years on a detective's case file. Names, dates, figures, communications. Every phone call he'd documented, every email he'd kept, every meeting he'd noted because he was a lawyer, and lawyers note things even when they wish they couldn't, later be asked to produce those notes. By the time they were done, Copperhead had what the FBI had been missing. Special Agent Delgado was still at Hargrove Academy, coordinating the initial document seizure when Copperhead called her cell at 5:48 a.m. She picked up on the second ring. How long has your office known about Greer? Copperhead asked. A pause. We opened a financial irregularities file on the Clearwater Educational Trust 14 months ago. The trust amendment raised flags during a routine probate audit. We've been building the financial case through legal channels. While building, Copperhead said. How long? The pause was longer this time. 14 months. We got the boy out in 11 hours. You had 14. He let that sit. I'm not saying it to score a point, Copperhead said. I'm saying it because the case you've been building is incomplete without what we found tonight. There's a third victim before Cole, a 14-year-old girl in Missoula, 2019. Same attorney, same examiner, same financial pattern. The attorney is Marcus Pruitt, currently in Billings. He has documentation of all 3 arrangements and is prepared to cooperate fully. Delgado stopped writing, set her pen down, leaned forward slightly. If Pruitt cooperates, Copperhead continued, you have a 3-case pattern, documentary evidence across 8 years, and an examiner who signed off on 2 of the 3 deaths, both with no inquest ordered. That changes your scope considerably. What do you need from us? 1 condition. Emmett Hale gets a victim advocate assigned before his first official interview. Nobody talks to him without him asking first. That's standard victim protocol. Then there's no reason it shouldn't be confirmed tonight. Agreed. 1 more. Copperhead looked toward the window where US 89 was just beginning to gray at the edges with early light. Dr. Carl Fry, the medical examiner who ruled on Cole and on the Missoula girl. His rulings need to be formally reviewed before this week is out. Don't let the caseload bury it. Agent Delgado. She turned. You do right by these kids. A beat. That's the job, she said. The line went dead. Here is what the full accounting showed, once the scope was assembled, and it took 3 days and 2 federal agencies to put it together completely. But these were the numbers that sat on a table in a Billings conference room by the following Tuesday. 3 children, 1 living, 2 dead, both ruled accidental by the same examiner, both drownings at outdoor education sites, both within 9 months of a trust amendment naming the guardian as beneficiary. Total trust money extracted or positioned for extraction across all 3 cases, $539,300. Nolan Greer's take on the 2 completed arrangements, $260,800. Marcus Pruitt's filing fees and arrangement payments across all 3 cases, $41,700. Operational costs, the compound, the vehicles, the 8 acres of additional forest land purchased under the LLC, a rifle collection billed as wilderness safety equipment, came to $34,500, all drawn from Emmett Hale's trust before February's review window. Dr. Carl Fry's 7 rulings over 8 years at Clearwater County, all accidental deaths connected to properties associated with Greer's network, were referred to the State Medical Examiner's Oversight Board for formal review. Charges filed against Nolan Greer: felony child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment of a minor, fiduciary fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit homicide, 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree. Bail set at $900,000, a figure his attorney argued, and the judge declined to reduce, citing the weight of documentation and the existence of a 3rd intended victim, currently in protective custody. Marcus Pruitt, 3 counts of fraudulent probate filing, 2 counts of accessory to fiduciary fraud, 1 count of conspiracy. His cooperation agreement was filed the same day as Greer's arraignment. The Neighborhood Watch volunteers who had called Nolan Greer instead of 911, who had handed Emmett back with a smile and the word safe, were not charged with anything. There was no law against trusting the wrong person. That, as Copperhead noted in his written summary for the FBI case file, was a problem worth thinking about. Justice had been served, the narrator might say here, but justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. Sunday arrived quietly. No sunrise worth the name, just a gradual lightening of the sky from dark gray to pale gray. The kind of October morning that doesn't so much begin as simply become less dark. By 5:50 a.m., 10 minutes before the school bus would have rolled out of Hargrove Academy's rear lot toward a logging road that now had 4 Clearwater County Sheriff's vehicles parked across its access point, the school was in the hands of the state. Ward C was empty, not abandoned, emptied deliberately, with care, by people who understood the difference between removing children from a bad place and making them feel like the problem being solved. Razorback had coordinated with County Child Services from 4 a.m. onward. Phone calls, paperwork, emergency placement protocols, moving through the bureaucracy the way a man moves through a space he knows well, which is to say, without wasted motion. By first light, 5 boys had been placed in temporary protective housing through Clearwater County's emergency intake process, each with a club member present during the transition, so that no child went from one institutional space to the next without a known face beside them. The boy with the yellowing bruise on his jaw had fallen asleep in the back of Dust Cloud's truck on the way to the county facility. Dust Cloud drove the long way around, through roads that curved past the edge of the valley where the mountains came down close, so the boy would sleep longer. He didn't mention it to anyone. Emmett was somewhere different. The Coleridge Medical Clinic opened at 8 a.m. on Sundays for emergency intake, Dr. Patricia Oakes, 61 years old, had run the Sunday shift for 14 years and had seen most of what rural Montana could produce by way of medical emergency. When Razorback walked in at 7:55 with a boy in an oversized gray sweatshirt and a cracked watch on his wrist, she made the specific face of a doctor who has learned to assess without showing assessment. She had them in an examination room by 8:10. Razorback sat in the waiting area. He'd brought a paperback from his vest pocket, a habit from years of waiting in military hospital corridors, and he read 3 pages of it without registering a word. When the nurse came out to ask if he was family, he said, "Not technically, but close enough." The nurse looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and went back through the door. Dr. Oakes came out 40 minutes later. She reviewed her notes with Razorback in the measured language of a clinician who has learned to make hard information receivable. Malnourishment consistent with restricted caloric intake over an extended period. Currently 11 pounds, below the expected weight range for his age and frame. The rope burns, partially healed, both wrists, were consistent with repeated rather than single-incident restraint. The scar above the right eyebrow was at minimum 6 months old and had received no medical attention. The grip bruising on the right forearm was recent, within the past 2 weeks. Razorback wrote everything down in his own notation system, the shorthand he'd developed in the Gulf that turned medical assessments into court-ready documentation. He'd done this before. He knew which details the prosecutor would need and which ones a defense attorney would try to characterize as ambiguous. Dr. Oakes looked at him over the top of her notes. "Thank you for getting him here when you did," she said. Not a performative thing, just a fact delivered quietly between 2 people who understood the gap between what had almost happened and what had instead. "Refeeding protocol," she continued. "Small, frequent meals for the first week. His system needs to relearn before we push the caloric density up. Nothing acidic. He'll be tired more than usual for about 10 days. After that, his body will start catching up fast. Kids do." She paused. The voice. "I want him to see a specialist who works with selective mutism in trauma presentations, not to fix anything, just to have someone in his corner who understands the mechanics. He spoke yesterday?" "He spoke," Razorback confirmed. "Then the pathway is there. It just needs time and safety. Mostly safety." She handed over the written care protocol. Razorback folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of his vest, where he kept the things that needed to make it home intact. The first safe meal was eggs and toast. Emmett chose it himself from the Coleridge Diner's Sunday menu, the same booth he'd sat in the night before, the same red vinyl, the same jukebox nobody was feeding quarters to. Dust Cloud sat across from him, reading a newspaper the way people read newspapers when they're actually just being present, without performing presence. The eggs arrived, steam rising off them in slow curls. Emmett looked at the plate for a moment, that same checking stillness, the brief assessment of something that might be taken back. Then he picked up the fork. He ate without watching the door. That was the thing. He ate the whole plate without once turning to check the entrance. Halfway through, the smell of the food, butter and black pepper and the specific warmth of something cooked without a timer, mixed with the coffee and the old vinyl and the sound of the cook's radio in the back kitchen, and something in his shoulders did something they hadn't done in 22 months at Hargrove. They simply rested. His hand moved toward the Casio watch once, habit reaching, and then came back to the fork instead. 3 taps, and then stillness. Just stillness. The housing question had been solved, the way most things in the Glacier chapter got solved, through a combination of stubbornness and the specific social capital that accumulates in a community over 11 years of quiet, consistent presence. Margaret Ballow owned a 2-bedroom house on Crescent Street, 4 blocks from Coleridge Elementary, that she rented occasionally and had kept empty since last spring when her previous tenant moved to Missoula for work. She was 67, had known Gideon Marsh by sight for a decade, and when Copperhead knocked on her door at 7 Sunday morning and explained the situation in plain terms, she said, "How long will he need it?" "Until we know what's next. Could be weeks, could be longer." "Is he safe to be around?" "He's 11 years old, and he just helped put 3 people in front of a federal judge. He's about the safest person I know right now." She went inside and came back with a key on a blue lanyard. "The heating's a little slow in the morning. Give it 20 minutes after you turn it on." The chapter covered the first 3 months. Not a donation, a decision, made the way the Glacier chapter made decisions about things that mattered, which was to say, without a formal vote, and without a formal announcement. Kettledrum handled the electronic transfer. Driftwood handled the letter to the county child services officer, confirming the housing arrangement as part of the protective placement record. Copperhead filed the paperwork to ensure Emmett's status as a minor in protective custody was properly documented before any questions of long-term guardianship could be raised by anyone with the wrong motives. Gideon drove Emmett to the house on Crescent Street at 10:30 Sunday morning. They stood on the front step for a moment while Gideon unlocked the door. Inside, a couch with a pattern on it that was trying to be cheerful. A kitchen with a window that faced east. A bedroom with a bed that had a headboard and actual pillows, 2 of them, white and properly filled, and a window that looked out onto a tree that still had half its October leaves. Emmett stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time. He was looking at the window. Outside it, the tree moved slightly in the morning wind. Light shifted through the remaining leaves, amber, rust, 1 or 2 still stubbornly gold, making slow patterns on the wall above the bed. He walked in, sat on the edge of the mattress, put both hands flat on the blanket and pressed down slightly, testing its reality. Then he looked up at Gideon. "There's no lock on the outside of the door," Emmett said. "No," Gideon said. "There isn't." The boy nodded. He looked back at the window. The light kept moving through the leaves in long, unhurried waves. "Okay," Emmett said. The brothers said goodbye in the way men say things when they mean them, but don't know how to carry them at full volume. Kettledrum shook Emmett's hand with full formality, like they were completing a business arrangement between equals. "I'm putting my number in the contacts under K, any time. I mean that literally. Any time, any hour, any question." He paused. "Also, if anything weird happens with your watch, I can fix electronics." Emmett looked at the cracked Casio on his wrist. Something moved across his face. "It still runs," he said. "Good ones do," Kettledrum said. Razorback came last. He crouched so he was at eye level, not performing gentleness, just being practical about the height difference, and looked at Emmett directly. "You're going to be tired this week," he said. "That's your body doing what it needs to do. Let it. Eat the small meals at the times the doctor wrote down. Don't skip the 10 o'clock one just because you're not hungry yet. You will be." Emmett nodded. "And when you see the specialist about the voice thing, the one Dr. Oakes recommended." Razorback paused. "She's not going to try to make you talk. She's going to make it so talking is something that costs you less. There's a difference." "I talked yesterday," Emmett said. "Yeah, you did." Razorback stood. "Turns out the voice was always there." He walked to his motorcycle. Didn't look back. Some exits work better that way. Dust Cloud had already gone. He'd left quietly, the way he did everything. A handwritten note on the kitchen table that Emmett would find later, with a phone number and a single line. "If school gets loud, call me." I spent 14 years making loud schools quieter. Still pretty good at it. But this story isn't really about the paperwork, or the compound, or even the warrant that arrived at 11:17 p.m. It's about the distance between 40 feet of cracked asphalt and the rest of a life. 3 weeks. After that Saturday, Gideon was at the county animal shelter, Wednesday morning, his regular shift, when he saw the car pull into the lot across the street. A county child services vehicle. A woman he recognized as Emmett's caseworker getting out. And then, from the back seat, Emmett. They were going somewhere ordinary. He couldn't tell where. The grocery store, maybe, or the library, or one of the appointments that were now filling the boy's calendar in the careful, structured way that recovery fills a calendar when it's being done right. Gideon stayed where he was, just inside the shelter's chain-link fence, a leash in his hand, a 3-year-old mixed breed sitting at his knee looking up at him with the particular patience of a dog who has learned to read stillness. Emmett was wearing a coat that fit, not borrowed, not 2 sizes too large, a coat that had been bought for him specifically by someone who'd taken the time to note his measurements. He was walking in a straight line, not along the wall, not with his chin tucked and his shoulders rolled inward. He stopped on the sidewalk and looked at something in the tree above him. A bird, or a movement of light, or nothing in particular. Just looked up, the way children look at things when they are not monitoring the space behind them. Then the caseworker said something, and he followed her toward wherever they were going, and they turned a corner and were gone. Gideon stood at the fence for a while after that. What he felt wasn't clean. It wasn't the simple satisfaction of a thing accomplished. There was something underneath it that he didn't have a word for. A grief adjacent to gratitude, or a gratitude that lived right next to grief. The understanding that this boy would be okay, probably, in the ways that mattered most. And also the understanding that 22 months of Ward C had taken something from him that would not fully come back, only be worked around and eventually incorporated, the way a broken bone incorporates its healing and becomes dense at the fracture, and never quite the same shape. He thought about his nephew, the boy who would be 19, the trail that had gone cold 13 years ago. He folded that thought carefully, the way you fold something you can't throw away, but can't keep looking at either. He looked down at the dog at his knee. The dog looked back up at him. He unlatched the fence and walked back inside. He had 3 more animals to exercise before noon, then a call to return to Copperhead about the trial date. Then, at 4 o'clock, a meeting with the county child services supervisor about something she called a proposal he might be interested in. He wasn't done. That was the only thing he knew for certain, walking back across the shelter's gravel lot with a leash in his scarred left hand, and the October air carrying pine resin down from the mountains. He wasn't done. 8 months later, Emmett Ray Hale was sitting in a chair at Coleridge Elementary with a science project on the desk in front of him, a working model of a water filtration system, 3 stages, built from materials that the science teacher would later describe in her notes as impressively sourced, when a girl 2 rows ahead of him knocked her notebook off her desk. It hit the floor and slid under the chair of the boy beside her, who picked it up and flipped through 2 pages before handing it back without comment. Emmett watched this. He watched the girl take the notebook back and say nothing, and he watched her turn to the front of the room and write the date at the top of a fresh page in very small, very controlled handwriting. He knew that handwriting. Not literally, but he recognized its shape, the handwriting of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible on a page, because taking up space on pages, in rooms, in the world, had costs attached to it that other people's handwriting didn't. He didn't say anything then, not in class, but at lunch, he carried his tray to the table where she was sitting alone and put it down across from her without asking. She looked up, the specific look of someone who has been left alone enough times that the approach of another person registers first as a threat assessment. "Your filtration project," Emmett said. You have the stages out of order. Sedimentation needs to come before carbon filtration, or the carbon layer clogs in under a week. She looked at him. I can show you, Emmett said. If you want. She looked at him for another moment. Then she moved her tray 2 inches to make room for his. That was how it started. In the months that had preceded this moment, Emmett had done things that the system's optimistic paperwork had predicted, and the system's actual capacity had only partially enabled. He'd seen the selective mutism specialist twice a month, a woman in Missoula who worked specifically with trauma-linked speech patterns in children and who had, as Razorback had promised, not tried to make Emmett talk. She'd made talking cheaper. Incrementally, session by session, the cost had come down until speaking to a stranger in a school cafeteria was something that took effort, but didn't require the specific kind of courage that should only have to be summoned once in a lifetime. His weight was back to the normal range. Dr. Oakes had noted it at the 6-month checkup with the specific satisfaction of a doctor who likes being right about children's resilience. He was on the honor roll. Not because he'd worked particularly hard at it, because he'd always been working hard at it, even when the school he was in had no honor roll and no mechanism for recognizing what he was doing. Hargrove Academy's glowing progress notes, Copperhead had noted in his case summary, had been the one part of the documentation that was accurate, in the sense that it correctly recorded a child continuing to learn and perform academically, under conditions designed to prevent exactly that. That fact, a child doing well on paper while being systematically harmed, had become part of the FBI's training materials on private residential placement evaluation. The case file was being studied, not just by the agents involved, but by the county school boards in 3 states that had reached out to Clearwater County after the trial, asking how the gap in private residential oversight had been allowed to persist and what structural changes would close it. Carol Vance, the former school board trustee who had voted against eliminating welfare checks 4 years earlier, had accepted an appointment to a state-level review panel on private residential school standards. She'd submitted a formal proposal reinstating mandatory monthly third-party welfare checks for all children in private residential placements across the state. The proposal was moving through the legislative review process. It was moving slowly, but it was moving. Driftwood stopped by Crescent Street twice in those 8 months, both times with no announcement, once with a box of winter clothes that were, without explanation, exactly the right size, and once with a bag of groceries that included, among ordinary things, a new notebook. Spiral-bound, 3x5, blank pages. He left it on the kitchen table without comment and was back on his motorcycle before anyone thought to ask him about it. 4 years later, Emmett Hale was 15, working a Saturday shift at the Coleridge Animal Shelter, a position he'd applied for himself in writing, in a letter that the shelter director later described to Gideon as the most methodical volunteer application I've received in 20 years, when a boy came into the lobby and stood at the front desk without speaking. He was maybe 10, thin in the specific way that has nothing to do with appetite. Wearing a sweatshirt with a school logo on it, the kind issued rather than chosen. His eyes moved to the exits before they moved to the animals. The shelter director was in the back. The other volunteer was on a call. Emmett was at the front desk. He looked at the boy for a moment. He recognized the look. He'd worn it for over 3 years. He knew it from the inside, the combination of exhaustion and the specific, battered hope of someone who hasn't been believed enough times to stop trying, but hasn't quite given up yet. The face of a person who has planned their approach. He picked up the sign-in sheet and set it aside. Put both hands flat on the desk, palms down. "I work here on Saturdays," Emmett said. "My name's Emmett. You can look at the dogs if you want. The big one in the 3rd kennel, her name's Wren. She's the best one." The boy looked at him, checked the exits again. "She won't bark," Emmett said. "She's quiet. She just listens." Something shifted in the boy's face. Not trust exactly. The beginning of the question of whether trust was available. He walked toward the kennel. Emmett waited until the boy's hand was through the chain link, and Wren had pressed her broad skull up against it, before he picked up the shelter's phone and dialed Gideon's number. Gideon picked up on the second ring. "There's a kid here," Emmett said, keeping his voice level and low, facing the window. "He hasn't said anything yet, but I know the look." A beat of silence on the line. "I'll be there in 8 minutes," Gideon said. Emmett set the phone down, turned back toward the kennel where the boy was sitting on the floor now, both arms around a brindle pit bull who had leaned her full weight into him and was staying there. He stood at a distance, not crowding, just present, the way someone had once been present for him at a 2-pump gas station on US 89. Gideon was back at Ridgeline Gas and Tire the following spring, not for anything particular. A rear tire that needed pressure, a ride he'd been meaning to take since autumn, a Saturday with enough light in it. He pulled up to the air pump on the east wall, the same pump, the same cracked asphalt, same propane sign on the building, though someone had replaced the hinge so it no longer swung loose. Wren sat beside the motorcycle. She was 7 now, slower to rise, a little gray at the muzzle. She still watched the highway with the same ancient patience. He crouched beside the rear wheel with the pressure gauge in his right hand and let the familiar smell of motor oil and road dust and cold mountain air settle around him. The pine resin carried in off the hills to the west. The highway wind, the faint diesel trace from a truck refueling on the far pump. In his vest pocket, his phone had 73 messages he hadn't answered yet. Most of them were from a network of families, connected through a program the Glacier chapter had started in the 6 months after the trial, at the suggestion of the county child services supervisor who'd called it a proposal he might be interested in. The Angels Watch program, a support network for children in private residential placements, staffed by volunteers who knew which questions to ask and which systems to navigate and which calls, made at the right time to the right people, could close the gap that formal bureaucracy moved too slowly to close. 3 other county chapters in Montana had contacted them about modeling it. Idaho was in conversation. Oregon had asked for documentation. Gideon looked down at the pressure gauge in his right hand, then at the left hand, the missing finger, the old K9 training scar, the tattoo on the forearm above it. Atlas, the dog killed in Kandahar, the dog he'd carried for 20 years in a name on his skin. He thought about what he would say if he were the kind of man who said things like this out loud. He would say, "There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from spending years watching the wrong people be trusted. Teachers who look away, investigators who build cases on the correct timetable while children remain in buildings with padlocked corridors. Forms that travel through systems that were built for ordinary cases and move at ordinary speed." He had felt that loneliness for a long time. He had felt it first at 38, when he came home from his second deployment to a cold foster care trail, and a nephew who had already become invisible to the system that was supposed to keep him visible. He would say, the thing that moved him was not anger. He'd carried enough anger over enough years to know it wasn't the thing that made the difference. The thing that made the difference was precision. Specific knowledge applied at the specific moment, with the specific people who knew which legal lever in which county created which kind of pressure. His chapter hadn't replaced the system. They'd learned how to make the system work faster than it was inclined to on its own. He would say, a boy who hadn't spoken in over 3 years had pressed his face against a dog's neck and said he smells like gunpowder, and trusted that something on the other end of that sentence would not walk away. And that trust, placed in a dog, and heard by a man 3 feet away, and transmitted outward through a network of people who answered their phones at 2 in the morning, had been enough, just enough. He pressed the gauge to the valve. Let the reading settle. Wren turned her head and looked up at him. He scratched behind her ear. Good girl, he said. There's a version of this story where the important thing is the bikers, the leather, the engines, the scale of it. 109 motorcycles on a logging road in the Montana dark. A warrant signed at midnight. A school dean in handcuffs by dawn. That version is true, but it's not the center. The center is 11 words spoken into the neck of a dog after 3 years of silence. The center is a boy who ran out of adults who would read his notepad, who had the system fail him not once, but 7 times, in 7 different forms, by 7 different people who all had reasonable explanations, and who found, at the end of a 2-mile walk in socked feet, one person willing to sit down on cracked asphalt and listen. If you are watching this, and you have ever been the person in that parking lot, the one who saw something and walked around it, I'm not saying that to accuse you. I'm saying it because most of us have been that person at some point. We've calculated the cost of involvement. We've told ourselves it probably wasn't what we thought. We've looked at the logo on a child's sweatshirt and let it reassure us when the child's face was telling us something different. The thing the neighborhood watch volunteers did, calling Nolan Greer instead of 911, because Nolan Greer was who they knew and trusted and had always found reliable, was not an act of malice. It was an act of misplaced familiarity. And it is one of the most dangerous acts a community can perform, because it looks like care from every angle, except the one occupied by the child being handed back. You do not need a warrant. You do not need a chapter behind you. You need to read the notepad. That is all. Read the notepad. Don't step around it. Pay attention when a child moves along walls instead of through the middle of rooms. Pay attention when a child checks the exits before they look at the animals. Pay attention when someone communicates in the smallest possible writing, on the smallest possible pages, the way a person writes when they've learned that taking up space has consequences. You don't need an engine or a vest. You need to be the person who does not calculate the cost before they answer. Emmett Hale is not an unusual child. He is an unusually precise child, resourceful, methodical, patient in a way no 11-year-old should have to be. But the situation he was in is not unusual. Right now, in private residential facilities across this country, in foster arrangements and guardianship placements and programs that look organized and legitimate from every angle that gets officially reviewed, there are children filling notepads. Some of them will find a dog to press their face against. Some of them will find the person 3 feet away who sets down what he's doing and listens. Some of them won't. The difference, more often than not, is one adult who decided that an uncomfortable feeling in the chest was worth acting on. One adult who asked the question out loud instead of walking around it. If this story moved you, subscribe to Valiant Bikers and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments below and tell us, was there a moment in your life when someone saw you and didn't look away? Or a moment when you wish you'd looked harder? We read every one, and wherever you're watching from tonight, living room television, phone in a quiet house, tablet in a kitchen while something simmers on the stove, remember that the most important sentence in this entire story was 13 words. Help me. He smells like gunpowder, and he's coming back Sunday. Not spoken to authority, not spoken to the system, spoken to a dog, and heard by a man who had been carrying the right kind of loss for exactly the right number of years. On a cracked asphalt lot on US 89 in Coleridge, Montana. On a Saturday afternoon in October, when the sky was the color of old tin and the wind was carrying pine resin down from the mountains. When an 11-year-old boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years, 2 months, and 4 days made himself as small as a child can make himself, crossed 40 feet of open space, and trusted that something was going to be different this time, he was right.